Hello, this is a Stories from the Camp. Thank you for visiting us. It would be great if you subscribed and gave us a like, and also write a comment. Enjoy listening. You live in a warm apartment. You have a shower, a microwave, and pizza that arrives with a single tap. And yet, you think life is hard. But imagine this. You wake up in a wooden hut. The stove is cold. The water comes from a well, and the toilet is outside, past the chickens. Work begins at sunrise. Dinner? Depends on what you didn't eat yesterday. Or maybe you're in the Soviet Union. 10 people share your apartment. Hot water comes once a week. If the store got something, the whole block is already in line. You don't choose what to wear, where to study, or even what to say. Happiness must be earned and then reported. People didn't live like we do. They survived. Through cold, through rations, through silence, through plans and punishments. That's just how it is. And if you think you'd handle it just fine, stay with me. You might think differently by the end of this story. Imagine waking up before the sun, not because your alarm went off, but because your body knew the cold wouldn't wait. In Imperial Russia, this was life for most. Not a routine, a survival pattern. Each morning began with a choice. Stay wrapped in a threadbare blanket and freeze, or get up and start moving before the frost found your bones. There was no central heating, no thermostat. The only source of warmth was the stove, if there was wood left to burn. And even then, it had to be lit, fed, managed. Warmth was not a given. It was earned. For peasants, who made up the overwhelming majority, the day began with chores, not coffee. Fetching water, chopping wood, milking animals, feeding chickens. All before breakfast, if there even was one. Bread, if you were lucky. Potato, if you were very lucky. Most meals in the empire were not about enjoyment, but about just getting by, keeping your hands moving and your stomach from protesting too loudly. The Soviet Union didn't change this rhythm so much as it institutionalized it. Routine became sacred. Get up, line up, clock in, repeat. You woke up early, not to enjoy the day, but to claim your place in the system. Whether you were a factory worker or a teacher, your life was organized by a plan. Not your plan, the 5-year plan. Efficiency trumped individuality. Time was not yours. It belonged to the collective. Stores opened early, but goods rarely arrived on time. Or at all. The phrase "they've thrown out milk" meant you dropped everything and ran. Not because milk was a luxury, but because it was perishable. It was there now, and it would be gone soon. Entire days were spent chasing rumors of deliveries, standing in line for hours just to get a bag of sugar or a piece of butter. And when you got home, you boiled water because the tap might not work. You folded your bed because it was also the couch. You shared your kitchen with a neighbor, your bathroom with 3 families, and your thoughts with no one. Privacy wasn't a concept, it was a fantasy. The walls were thin, and ears were everywhere. There was no weekend in the modern sense. Saturdays often meant subbotniks, mandatory volunteer labor, cleaning streets, painting fences, picking up litter that didn't belong to you. Volunteering, but under watch. Refusing wasn't an option. It was for the good of the people. It was part of building communism. So you went, and you smiled. Sometimes, through it all, the repetition, the scarcity, the gray, people kept going. They found meaning in small things. A radio that worked, a new curtain, a good harvest. They survived on routine because the alternative, uncertainty, was even worse. To live in Imperial Russia or the USSR wasn't just about adapting to the environment. It was about submitting to it, bending your life around the cold, the rules, the shortages. Each day was a quiet negotiation between what you wanted and what was available. Most days, what you wanted didn't matter. Today, we eat because we're bored, because it's noon, or because a food delivery app beeped. In Imperial Russia or the Soviet Union, food wasn't a convenience. It wasn't even a guaranteed part of your day. It was something you pursued, with effort, with time, sometimes with shame. Eating wasn't a joy. It was a task. In the Russian Empire, especially in the countryside, food was deeply seasonal and strictly local. Most peasants ate what they could grow, store, or scavenge. There were no supermarkets, no repression, no tomatoes in December. You planted in spring, harvested in fall, And if you misjudged the weather or the soil betrayed you, you didn't eat. A peasant's diet might consist of dark rye bread. If there was grain, cabbage soup, known as shkai, and perhaps potatoes, though even those became common only in the 19th century. Meat? Rare, unless you lived in a household wealthy enough to butcher livestock, which meant giving up a source of milk, labor, or wool. Meat was often reserved for holidays or funerals, which in some villages meant you were more likely to eat pork if someone died. Cooking was done over a wood-fired stove. Meals were simple and repetitive. Bread, porridge, soup, all in heavy clay bowls. You'd eat sitting at a rough wooden table, usually with your family, often in silence. There was no table setting, no dessert course, no napkins. If you spilled something, you wiped it with your sleeve. If you were still hungry, you drank water and went to sleep. The city wasn't much better for the working poor. Factory workers lived in overcrowded barracks or shared apartments, eating thin beet soup and kasha, grain porridge. In industrial towns, bread was rationed and queues formed before dawn. Restaurants existed for the wealthy. For everyone else, food was fuel, not flavor. Fast forward to the Soviet Union, and food remained central to the question of survival. But now it was politicized, standardized, and planned. The Soviet government took control of food production, pricing, and distribution. This meant everyone theoretically had access, but in practice, it meant everyone stood in line. The word deficit, became a part of daily vocabulary. Butter was deficit. Cheese was in deficit. Sausage was in deficit. Everything people actually wanted to eat was always missing. Grocery stores, known as gastronome, had long, sad rows of empty shelves. If something appeared, people dropped everything and ran. Entire blocks would line up for hours just to buy one item: sour cream, condensed milk, or, on magical days, oranges. You didn't ask why oranges were available. You asked how many you were allowed to take. And yet, somehow, everyone knew the schedule. There were rumors, whispers. They're unloading meat at store number 42, someone would say, and suddenly the whole neighborhood turned into a stampede. The line itself became a social event. People brought stools, flasks of tea, and even books. You could spend half your day standing in one line for bread and the rest in another for soap. It wasn't shopping. It was a kind of national sport. Rural life in the USSR added its own absurdities. Collective farms, kolkhozes, were meant to feed the country, but shortages were common even there. Farmers sometimes couldn't afford the very produce they harvested. Chickens laid eggs, but those eggs belonged to the state. Cows gave milk, but only part of it made it home. The rest was planned output. Menus in canteens and cafeterias were theoretical. You might walk into a Soviet stolovaya and see a signboard listing beef cutlets, mashed potatoes, pickled cucumbers, and compote. In reality, they had cabbage. Just cabbage. But it was still listed as a 3-course meal because the plan said so. Cooking at home wasn't easy either. People learned to adapt, substitute, make do. Mayonnaise and boiled eggs became luxury garnishes. Vinegar was used in place of lemon. Sugar was hoarded. People developed culinary creativity not for taste, but to hide the taste. Recipes were invented based on what was available, not what was intended. And yet, food still meant something. It was a gesture of care. Mothers spent hours making vinaigrette salad from whatever root vegetables they could find. A grandmother's potato pancakes could make a child's day. A friend offering you a slice of smoked sausage was offering you something close to love. Food in the USSR wasn't about flavor. It was about sacrifice, strategy, and patience. People learned to stretch soup for 3 days. They learned how to stand in line without going mad. They learned to celebrate canned peaches as if they were gold. If you grew up in that system, it made you grateful for very small things. A slice of butter bread, a spoonful of jam, a glass of tea. Today, people talk about following their passion. Find a job you love, they say, and you'll never work a day in your life. In Imperial Russia and the Soviet Union, no one said that, because no one believed it. Work wasn't a passion. It was a sentence. You didn't do what you loved. You did what you had to. Let's start with Imperial Russia. For most people, especially peasants, Work began at 5 or 6 years old. That wasn't an exaggeration. Children fetched water, watched livestock, helped in the fields, and learned to carry their weight long before they learned to write. Education, if it came at all, was a luxury. Rural schools were rare. There were fewer teachers. And books? You didn't read books. Books were for priests and landlords. Most peasants worked on land they didn't own. They paid rent in crops or labor. They farmed with their hands, guided by instinct and superstition more than science. Summers were long, brutal, and full of sweat. Winters were longer, darker, and full of dread. You prayed for rain, but not too much. For sun, but not too hot. One bad season, and your family starved. In the cities, things weren't much better. If you worked in a factory, your day started with a bell and ended with exhaustion. 12-hour shifts were common. Accidents were frequent. Protections? None. Unions? Illegal. You worked with machines, among soot and fire, and hoped your lungs would hold out longer than your job. And then came the Soviet Union. In theory, it promised dignity and equality. In reality, it redefined exhaustion. Work became a moral obligation. To not work, even if you were sick or jobless, was a crime. Tierneyetstva, social parasitism, could get you arrested. You had to work. The state demanded it. But what did work actually mean? It meant sitting at a desk, doing nothing, just to say you were employed. It meant sweeping the same hallway 10 times a day because the foreman needed activity. It meant being a geologist on paper and a potato farmer in reality. Entire offices existed with no real tasks, just to fulfill quotas. Productivity wasn't measured by output. It was measured by paperwork. Everything had to be documented, stamped, approved. Reports were written to justify reports. 5-year plans were crafted with absurd goals. And when the goals weren't met, they were rewritten. Reality bent to fit the plan, not the other way around. Workers weren't praised for creativity. They were praised for silence. You didn't raise questions. You didn't innovate. You followed instructions. The only initiative was overfulfilling the plan, whether it made sense or not. Some workers were celebrated for producing 300% of the quota. How? No one knew. The math didn't matter. The applause did. Factories produced products no one needed, in quantities no one could store, using parts that didn't fit. A famous joke went like this: we pretend to work, and they pretend to pay us. And what about education? In Imperial Russia, school was rare. In the USSR, it was universal and heavily ideological. You didn't just learn math or grammar. You learned about Lenin 5 days a week. History was rewritten regularly. One year, a figure was a hero. The next year, erased. Students memorized dates, slogans, and speeches. Critical thinking was discouraged. Loyalty was everything. Uniforms were mandatory. Behavior was strictly monitored. You weren't just a student. You were a future builder of communism. There were parades, flag ceremonies, and mandatory poems. Teachers didn't just teach, they watched you, and sometimes reported to you. University wasn't about your grades. It was about your background. If your parents weren't from the right class, or if you had relatives abroad, good luck. Connections helped. So did silence. Even with a degree, your job was often assigned. You didn't pick your field. The field picked you. You might study engineering and be sent to teach in a remote village. You might become a doctor and end up managing paperwork at a factory. And through it all, people kept going. They formed quiet friendships. They found dignity in little things: a well-swept floor, a mended shirt, a shared cigarette behind the warehouse. They didn't work to live. They lived because they had no choice but to keep working. If you lived in that system, you knew the rules. You knew when to nod, when to smile, and when to say nothing. You learned to navigate a world where working hard didn't mean success. It just meant survival. And if you didn't grow up with that, if you've ever said, "I just want to find a job that aligns with my values," then no, you wouldn't have made it. But someone did, and they left behind stories, not of triumph, but of endurance. Today, when we think about where we live, we talk about neighborhoods, floor plans, and a nice view. We browse listings. We argue about renting versus buying. But in the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union, housing wasn't a choice. It was a roll of the dice, and usually the dice were rigged. Let's begin with the Russian Empire. For most people, especially peasants, a home meant a wooden hut called an izba. It was built by hand, passed down through generations, and often shared with animals in winter. Not out of sentiment, out of survival. The body heat of goats and chickens helped warm the single room where an entire family slept, worked, ate, and prayed. Inside, there was a large pechka, a brick stove used for cooking, heating, and sometimes sleeping. Children might climb onto it at night because it was the warmest spot. There were no beds in the modern sense, just benches, pallets, and the occasional straw mattress, filled and refilled until it lost its shape. Walls leaked cold. Roofs leaked rain. Floors were often just packed earth. There was no plumbing, no insulation, no privacy. In the long winters, smoke filled the room. Eyes burned. The air was thick, but you were alive, and that counted. Now fast forward to the Soviet Union, a state that promised equality, dignity, and shelter for all. And to be fair, it tried. But when you centralize housing, you also centralize shortage. In early Soviet years, communal apartments, or communalki, became the norm in cities. A large apartment, once owned by a wealthy merchant or nobleman, was divided into many small rooms. One family per room, sometimes more. You could have 3 generations sleeping in 12 square meters. Your neighbor, on the other side of a paper-thin wall, might be a retired officer, a factory worker, or someone who reported you to the authorities last year. You shared one toilet, one kitchen, one sink, dozens of lives overlapping in a single decaying space. Want to cook? Wait your turn. Want to bathe? Boil water on the stove and carry it to the tub. Want silence? Good luck. Arguments broke out constantly over noise, smells, refrigerator shelves, or stolen soap. Locks were placed on cabinet doors. Children learned early not to speak freely because anyone could be listening. Anyone could report you. And still, people made it work. Curtains were hung to create the illusion of walls. Rugs were nailed to walls for warmth and dignity. Radios were kept low, but always on, a kind of company in a crowded loneliness. As the years passed, the government began building Khrushchevkas, low-cost, 5-story apartment blocks, named after Nikita Khrushchev. These buildings were small, gray, and almost identical. But for many, they were a dream come true. For the first time, families had their own front door, their own kitchen, their own bathroom, no sharing. The apartments were tiny. The ceilings were low. The walls were thin, but they were private, and that was revolutionary. You didn't choose where to live. Housing was assigned by your workplace or local authorities. You applied. You waited, sometimes for years. If you were single, you were expected to share a room with strangers. If you had children, you were bumped up the list. But nothing was guaranteed. Upkeep was minimal. Pipes leaked. Elevators broke. Paint peeled. But complaints rarely led to action. Maintenance crews were overworked, underpaid, and often indifferent. You learned to fix things yourself, or to live with them broken. Want to move? Not so simple. Swapping apartments required paperwork, negotiations, approvals. And if you try to trade up unofficially, you risked attention you didn't want. In rural areas, housing was often even worse. Wooden barracks, mud brick homes, collective farms with dorm-style buildings, firewood for heat, wells for water, outhouses still. But wherever they lived, Soviet citizens adapted. They decorated. They celebrated. They made tea, hung lace curtains, and played records. A little radio on the windowsill, a houseplant on the ledge, a photo of Gagarin or Lenin or just family. They found pride in what little they had, not because it was enough, but because it was theirs, or at least it felt like it was. So no, you didn't choose your home. It chose you, based on your job, your luck, your status. There was no real estate market, no dream house, just walls, windows, and the will to survive inside them. You probably take showers daily, maybe even twice if you're feeling fancy. You have toothpaste with whitening crystals, shampoo that smells like fruit, and a medicine cabinet full of things you hope you never need. That level of hygiene? Luxury. Back then, it wasn't just rare, it was unimaginable. Let's start with the Russian Empire. Cleanliness was not a virtue. It was a logistical nightmare. Most peasants bathed a few times per year, often during special occasions like religious holidays or weddings. There was no running water. No indoor plumbing. If you wanted to wash, you fetched water from a well, heated it on a stove, and poured it into a basin. That was your spa day. Soap was expensive and hard and probably homemade. If it smelled like anything, it was ash and lard. Laundry was beaten on river stones or boiled in cauldrons. Clothes were worn until they nearly walked away on their own. 'Cause common. Fleas? Expected. Bedbugs? Permanent residents. Medical care? If you were lucky, a village might have a feldsher, a sort of half-trained medical worker. More often, your doctor was a grandmother with herbs, a prayer book, and a firm belief in vodka compresses. Bleeding, leeches, and superstition filled the gaps where science hadn't arrived. You didn't go to the doctor for prevention. You went when you were already halfway to the other side. Now, enter the Soviet Union. Things got better. Sort of. The Soviet state prided itself on universal, free health care, and technically, it delivered. Hospitals existed. Clinics functioned. Doctors were assigned by the state and trained in universities. But quantity doesn't always equal quality. You could see a doctor. That didn't mean they had medicine. Pharmacies often had shelves of dusty bottles, none of which matched your prescription. If you needed something rare like antibiotics or insulin, you might need connections, or bribes, or luck. Hospital beds were crowded. The sheets were gray. Equipment was outdated or broken. Nurses were overworked and underpaid. Cleanliness? It depended on the facility, the staff, and sometimes your political reliability. A model patient got better care than a complainer. Preventative care existed in slogans, posters, and lectures. Hygiene is the key to socialism, they said. But hot water might come twice a week. Public baths, banyas, were the go-to. Solution. They were crowded, steamy, loud, and sometimes glorious. But again, not a daily ritual, and never private. Toothbrushes were shared in families. Shampoo came in bars. Toilet paper was a luxury, often replaced with torn pages from newspapers, which meant many Soviet citizens knew the face of the general secretary intimately. Children went to school with runny noses and coughs. There were health campaigns, vaccines, lice checks, dental inspections, but they were often rushed, inconsistent, and terrifying. Ever had a filling done with no anesthesia? Soviet kids did. Often. But still, people survived. They drank herbal tea when there was no medicine. They gargled with salt. They used onions, garlic, vodka, and anything else. And when they were really sick, they didn't complain. Because complaining could be seen as political. You were expected to endure, not protest. Doctors did what they could with what they had. Some were brilliant. Many were sincere. But they, too, were bound by the system. A bad diagnosis could be punished. A mistake could cost your job, or worse. So yes, Soviet healthcare was free. But free doesn't mean painless. And cleanliness? It came second to ideology. Third, maybe, there are rules. And then there is fear. In both Imperial Russia and the Soviet Union, fear wasn't just an emotion. It was infrastructure. It held things together when law, reason, or fairness couldn't. It was in the walls, in the silence, in the glances people exchanged but never explained. It was the system's most reliable tool, and its most invisible. In the Russian Empire, fear came from above and from all sides. The Tsar was absolute. The church was unquestionable. The police were unpredictable. And if you were a peasant, your local landlord could be your judge, your tax collector, and your executioner, all in one person. There was no appeal. You obeyed or you paid. People feared exile to Siberia, not as a story, but as a possibility. With a few strokes of a pen, you could be uprooted and sent thousands of kilometers away for suspicious behavior, blasphemy, or simply for complaining. And no one would know where you went, or why. Rebellion was suicide. Talking back was dangerous. Even thinking aloud, in the wrong tavern, in front of the wrong ears could end your life as you knew it. But then came the Soviet Union, and fear became not just a tool, but a design principle. It was engineered into everyday life, like pipes or electricity. Not visible, but always present. It began with surveillance. Not just from the KGB, but from your neighbor, your co-worker, your child's teacher. Anyone could report you. Anyone could denounce you. And they often did, for promotion, for revenge, or simply because they were afraid not to. You didn't joke about politics. You didn't speak freely at home. You didn't say what you thought, even to friends, because someone was always listening. And sometimes even you didn't know you were being listened to until it was too late. There were official truths and there was reality. The two didn't always align. But to question the truth was to mark yourself. You nodded. You smiled. You applauded. And if you didn't, someone noticed. Fear took many forms. The fear of being watched. The fear of being different. The fear of being noticed. In a system built on conformity, standing out was dangerous. Being too quiet, suspicious. Being too clever, risky. The safest thing to be was average. Invisible. Arrests came at night. Quietly. You went to sleep, and your neighbor didn't wake up. A missing face. A whisper in the hallway. No questions. Children learned early. Do not talk about what you hear at home. Do not repeat what your father said about bread shortages. Do not draw attention. They were taught not just math and reading, but survival. Even art lived under fear. Painters painted what they were told. Writers chose their words like surgeons. A wrong metaphor could end a career. A wrong stanza could erase your name from libraries. And yet people laughed. In private, behind closed curtains, dark jokes passed from mouth to mouth. Satire, irony, code words. Not rebellion, just release. Fear wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was quiet. A hesitation, a glance, a pause before answering a simple question. If you think childhood is about cartoons, iPads, and birthday parties at trampoline parks, you're right. That's what it is now. But in Imperial Russia and the Soviet Union, childhood was something entirely different. It was shorter, stricter, and quieter. In the Russian Empire, a child's worth was tied to how quickly they could become useful. Peasant children began working almost as soon as they could walk. They fed chickens, watched cows, hauled water, and helped with crops. Toys? Maybe a carved wooden doll or a ball made from rags. Most children didn't go to school. They learned how to survive. Childhood wasn't protected. It was borrowed and returned early. In cities, things were marginally better. Middle class or noble families might hire tutors, but only for boys. Girls were often taught to embroider, sing, and prepare for marriage. Education was a privilege, not a right. Playtime was quiet, controlled, and usually indoors. And above all, children were expected to be obedient. Seen, not heard. Fast forward to the Soviet Union, and things looked more modern on the surface. But underneath, childhood was still heavily structured and often politicized. Yes, every child went to school. Yes, there were youth organizations like the Pioneers or Komsomol. But these weren't just clubs. They were tools designed to mold young minds into ideal Soviet citizens. Discipline, loyalty, collectivism. Your free time wasn't always yours. From a young age, kids were taught slogans, marched in parades, and learned to revere the party. You saluted. You memorized speeches. You wore the red scarf. Not because you chose to, but because everyone did. And if you didn't, people noticed. Games existed, of course. Children ran, laughed, and scraped their knees. But even play had limits. In apartment courtyards, you had to be careful not to break a neighbor's window, because a report might follow. You couldn't talk too loudly about what your parents said at dinner. You couldn't joke about leaders or slogans or the lack of candy. Kids learned early. Fun was allowed, but only within invisible lines. There were few toys. Most were passed down, repaired, or improvised. A stick could be a sword. A tin can could be a car. Dolls were stitched by hand. If you had a real toy, a store-bought one, you were one of the lucky ones. And you guarded it carefully. Summer camps were one of the few joys, organized by the state, structured like military training, but filled with songs, swimming, and fresh air. For a child stuck in a gray city apartment, A trip to a Pioneerski lager felt like freedom as long as you followed the rules. Television? 1 or 2 channels. Programming ended at night. Cartoons were brief, stylized, and quiet. Books were cherished, not just for entertainment, but as escape. Fairy tales, space adventures, stories about hard-working Soviet heroes all served a purpose: to educate, to inspire, to keep the child in line. And yet, joy found its way in. Children whispered secrets, laughed when teachers weren't looking, shared candy under desks, made up rude nicknames for bureaucrats. Childhood, no matter how controlled, still tried to be wild. Freedom is one of those words we toss around casually. Freedom of speech, freedom of movement, freedom to choose your toothpaste, your partner, your future. But in Imperial Russia and the Soviet Union, freedom wasn't a right. It was a rumor, dangerous to hear, and even more dangerous to repeat. In a Russian Empire, you didn't have rights. You had roles. You were a subject, not a citizen. And that made all the difference. If you were a peasant, which most people were, your life was tied to land you didn't own, working for people you didn't vote for, under laws you didn't understand. For centuries, peasants were literally owned, serfs, bound to estates like furniture. Even after the official emancipation in 1861, most remained in crippling poverty, paying debts for land that was barely arable. You couldn't leave your village without permission. You couldn't protest. You couldn't dream too loudly. Newspapers were censored. Books were banned. Talking politics could get you jailed, or worse, exiled. Siberia wasn't a myth. It was a destination. One way. And if you were educated, a student, a thinker, you were even more dangerous. Because ideas were feared. Liberalism, socialism, democracy, anything that challenged the Tsar's order was viewed as sedition. The secret police, the Okhrana, had files, spies, prisons. They listened. They watched. They remembered. And then came the Soviet Union, built on revolution, on the promise of liberation. Workers would rule. Peasants would rise. The people finally free. Except they weren't. The state replaced the Tsar. The party replaced the nobility. But control? That stayed. You couldn't speak freely. Not really. Not unless you wanted a visit from the KGB. Jokes about Stalin were told in whispers, behind closed doors, with a glance at the window, just in case. Criticism of the system was treason. Even silence could be suspicious. Travel was restricted. Leaving the USSR was nearly impossible. Even moving within the country required permission. You couldn't simply pack up and go. You needed documents, approvals, signatures, and a reason. There were no elections, not meaningful ones. You could vote, yes, but only for the candidate already chosen. And everyone voted. Not voting was a political act. A dangerous one. Religion? Suppressed. Press? Controlled. Art? Censored. Freedom existed only on posters. Heroic workers gazing into the future, promising that real freedom was just one 5-year plan away. And yet people craved it. They read banned novels passed hand to hand. They listened to jazz on crackling radios. They printed forbidden poems in secret. They traveled in their minds, their music, their memories. Some took risks, protested, escaped. Most adapted. They found small freedoms. A private conversation, a late-night walk, a song hummed off-key. You learned to hide your soul in places the state couldn't reach. You like to think you're resilient, that you could survive anything. Cold showers, long hours, bad coffee. But the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union, that wasn't hardship. That was an ecosystem of survival, built on silence, shaped by obedience, and painted in gray. You wouldn't survive the hunger, the loss, the walls that listened, or the clocks that never told the truth. You wouldn't survive shared toilets and ration soap. You wouldn't survive filling out 30 forms for a loaf of bread. You wouldn't survive watching your neighbor vanish and never asking why. You wouldn't survive the absence of choice, the illusion of freedom, the weight of a future written by someone else. You wouldn't survive growing up too fast, or grieving in silence, or laughing only when the radio was loud enough to cover it. But someone did. Someone did survive all of that. Your grandmother, your great-uncle, the quiet man in the photo who never spoke much. The woman who always watched the news with her arms folded, as if waiting for something to go wrong. They made it, with calloused hands, frayed nerves, and stubborn hearts. They endured, adapted, whispered, remembered. And now you're here, with all the freedoms they never had. With light at the flick of a switch. With a voice you're allowed to use. So no, you wouldn't survive the Russian Empire or the USSR. But maybe you don't have to, because someone already did. For you.